The twin cultures of the Tupí and Guaraní have existed across South America for thousands of years, believed to have only split from each other sometime within the last 1,500 to 2,000 years. Despite millennia of self-differentiation, Tupí peoples and Guaraní peoples retain many linguistic and cultural similarities. The Tupí-Guaraní language family today is widely spoken and composed of some 40 to 50 individual languages. Based on linguistic evidence and the spread of the Amazonian polychrome tradition, there is reason to believe that the modern-day Brazilian state of Rondônia is the homeland of all Tupí-Guaraní populations, as over half of the Tupian languages that exist today are found within the Madeira River basin between the Guaporé River and Aripuanã River. However, Tupí-Guaraní languages can be found among indigenous populations throughout South America, including those in Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, French Guiana, and Peru. Paraguayan Guaraní in particular, which as of 2012 was spoken by an estimated 6 to 7 million people, is one of the most spoken indigenous languages in the Americas. The two other most spoken Amerindian languages, Mayan and Quechua, have about 6 to 7 million speakers each when collapsing all of their many dialects, some of which are not mutually intelligible. What further differentiates Paraguayan Guaraní from Mayan and Quechua is their speakers, as Paraguayan Guaraní is largely spoken by a population that does not identify exclusively as indigenous. In other words, it is spoken by more mestizos, those with mixed indigenous and European ancestry, than it is by native people. So why are there so many speakers of Paraguayan Guaraní today? In 1992, the nation of Paraguay had a new constitution ratified, which established both Spanish and Guaraní as the official languages of the recently democratized country. The authoritarian right-wing regime of Alfredo Stroessner lasted from 1954 and until his assassination in 1989, making him the second longest ruling dictator in Latin American history, the first being Fidel Castro of Cuba. It is worth mentioning that the United States government funded Stroessner's initial takeover as well as his violent regime, while later supporting the coup d'etat that brought his reign to an end. This is because Stroessner's human rights violations had generated so much international outcry that the US could no longer ignore it. Before these tensions, however, Paraguay was a strong ally to the US due to Stroessner's outspoken hatred of communism. This implicates the United States government in the genocide carried out against indigenous people in Paraguay during Stroessner's regime, such as the targeted genocide of Aceh people in the northern Chaco region. Despite centuries of systematic persecution and continued indigenous repression, the nation-state of Paraguay has retained a large Guaraní-speaking population since its inception. In 1537, a scouting party of Spaniards, having fled the first failed fort of Buenos Aires, established inter-ethnic relations with a large settlement of indigenous Carrillo, an ethnically Guaraní people, at a bend in the Paraguay River. The colonial fort established there, which was named Asunción, would go on to become the future capital city of the Paraguayan nation-state. In 1542, indigenous forces were able to expel the Spanish from Buenos Aires, pushing the starving colonizers north to Asunción. The fort was geographically isolated and relatively autonomous thanks to the thick Atlantic rainforest to the east and the semi-arid Chaco to the north. By this point, the Spaniards had taken Guaraní women as wives and concubines, producing children who were raised to speak their mother's tongue and appreciate their indigenous heritage. A bilingual Creole elite was thus born. This is at least how the national narrative is often framed. While the inter-ethnic relations of early Paraguay fall outside the purview of this video, it must be noted that there are countless instances of colonial violence, as well as repeated betrayals by the Spanish, which provide evidence of a remarkably unfair relationship from the beginning of contact, stretching into the present. The appropriation and falsification of indigeneity has long been an aspect of Paraguayan culture, especially as a means to establish a homogeneous national identity and narrative in the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1929, a Paraguayan named Narciso Ramón Colmán published the creation story of the Guaraní, calling the book Mbyá of Guairá, meaning our ancestors in Paraguayan Guaraní. Colman laid the foundations for today's most popular legends among the mestizo and non-indigenous populations of Paraguay, portraying them as a shared cultural touchstone to represent the Paraguayan race, a unique product of Spanish men and Guarani women. However, the myths contained in Yande Upucuera, including those of Monyay, Arasu, Kerana, Yasu Yatare, and Ao Ao, have no real basis in Guarani cosmology or culture. They were invented by Colman, while others, like Curupi and Tupá, were appropriated to fit his fictitious narrative. There are even statues dedicated to his creations in the Museo Mitológico Ramón Elias, which demonstrate just how entrenched this narrative is within the fabric of Paraguayan folklore. It was not until 30 years later, in 1959, that León Cadogan, a Paraguayan born of Australian parents, published the first true collection of sacred Guarani beliefs after living among the Mbyá of Guairá, located in the southern heart of the nation. The collection, called Ayvu Rapyta, or the Foundation of Human Speech, exists in the original Mbyá-Guaraní language alongside the Spanish translation completed by Cadogan. As far as I can tell, Cadogan only translated and published the first 2 chapters in English, so I had to translate the first 7 chapters of Ayvu Rapyta in order to make this video. Cadogan claims that these first 7 chapters make up the first annal of Guarani spirituality, what some have called their Book of Genesis. Although I will not be reading the translation verbatim, as it is quite rough, I will convey the overall narrative to the best of my ability, while incorporating ethnographic information that I believe is relevant as I go. A list of sources can be found in the description and at the end of this video. Before we start, I want to follow in the footsteps of Cadogan by naming the true authors of Ayvu Rapyta, his Mbyá informants. Chief Pablo Vera of Yro'ysã, Kachirito of Paso Jovái, Chief Cirilo of Alto, Elder Chiko'i of Tava'i, Tomás and Cirilo of Yvytuko, Mario Higinio of Cedroty, and the many whose names will never be known to us. In the first chapter of Ayvu Rapyta, we meet Nyamandu, also called Nyamanduru Ete, with Ru meaning father and Ete meaning true, thus, true father Nyamandu. He is the supreme being of the Mbyá-Guaraní pantheon, the very first god in existence. Floating amidst the primordial chaos, known as Putuma, Nyamandu crafts his body in shadows. He creates the soles of his feet and his apuka apu'ai, a tiny round stool, a symbol of bodily and spiritual support among the Guarani. He then creates the divine organs which he uses for sight and hearing, as well as the palms of his hands, one of which holds his ceremonial staff, or uvura'i, a symbol of masculinity. His fingers and nails bloom like flowers on a tree. He then creates his divine headdress, made of feathers and flower-like dewdrops. While drifting among the primordial winds, or uvutuma, Nyamandu is sustained by Maino'i, the primordial hummingbird, which feeds the creator god with sustenance gathered from the celestial dwelling place, or uvara. Although there is no sun yet, Nyamandu can see by virtue of his brilliantly shining heart, which is illuminated by his creative wisdom, or Quarara. Wherever Nyamandu stops to rest, the owl, or Urukurea'i, extends her wings and night is cast. In this primordial darkness, the hummingbird and owl seem to exist alongside Nyamandu, though another potential primordial animal is the tapir, or Tapi'i, whose path across the night sky creates the Milky Way, or Tapi'i Rapya, the tapir's path. The chapter concludes by establishing that each year, the primordial winds called Uvutuma return from the south in order to usher in winter, or Ara Uma Nyamokandire, literally resurrection of original time-space. The end of this period is marked by the flowering of the taju, or lapacho tree, which might parallel the flowering of Nyamandu's hands during his self-evolution amidst the darkness. This is the time of year when the northeastern winds, known as Yvytuko, return to herald the beginning of spring, known as Arapuau Nyamokandire, or resurgence of new time. As for summer, it is known as Kwarahupuku'ajepu, the return of long suns. In this way, the Mbyá conceive of wintertime as a return to the period before Nyamandu brought light and life to the universe through his own self-evolution. In the second chapter, we learn about the collection's namesake act, the foundation of human speech. First, Nyamandu stands upright, an act associated with life among the Mbyá, though we will learn more about this in a moment. At this point in Ayvu Rapyta, Nyamandu spontaneously causes the creation of Tatarendu, the sacred flames, and Tatashina, the sacred fog. He then creates the Nye, the word soul. This divine portion of Nyamandu's soul is the foundation of human speech. In Paraguayan Guaraní, the Nye is the piece of divinity that we humans carry within ourselves, often translated as soul, though it also refers to word and to speak. This is because among the Guarani, the act of speaking is seen as an expression of one's soul. The Mbyá believe that the Nye is bound to the human skeleton, therefore bones are considered to be sacred. It is the Nye that allows the body to stand upright. When someone can no longer speak or stand, they may be considered dead. Conversely, the flesh and blood of the body is associated with the imperfect portion of the spiritual self, Tupí-Guaraní, the principle of raw flesh that leads to physical and spiritual rot. This element of imperfection, or tekoashu, will be further discussed in the final chapter. After creating the foundation of human speech, Nyamandu Ruete also establishes Mborauku, which in Paraguayan Guarani means love, but can more accurately be understood in a spiritual context as a kind of reciprocal love. The notion of harmony within a community is central to many Guarani peoples. In fact, their language retains a phenomenon known as nasal harmonization. One way this impacts speech is the pluralization of nouns. In English, we generally use an S or ES on the end of nouns in order to represent plurality. This single cat versus multiple cats. In Guarani, however, plurality is not commonly demarcated. When it is relevant, the suffix guera is added. For instance, a single mbarakaja versus multiple mbarakaja guera. Where nasal harmonization comes into play is when a word is not oral, like mbarakaja, but nasal, like the word for friend, angirum. The nasality of triggers the harmonization of guera, transforming it into guera, thus a single angirum versus a pair of angirumuera. Still, pluralization is quite uncommon in Guarani, while nasal harmonization is impossible to avoid, which I think reflects the notions of communal harmony and reciprocal love, or mborauhu, being embedded within their language, which itself is considered something spiritually important. Returning to the narrative, we see Nyamandu create the beginning of a sacred hymn to be sung. Now, having formed the Nye from his divine spirit, having created a bit of mborauhu in isolation, and having sung the short hymn, Nyamandu wonders who will share these gifts with him. The shining light of Guarara in Nyamandu's heart produces a new being, Nyamandu Pu'awasu, literally big heart Nyamandu, though more accurately, brave-hearted Nyamandu. For clarity, I will use Nyamandu Ruete to differentiate the two. Nyamandu Ruete then instructs Nyamandu Pu'awasu to act as an intermediary between divinity and his future children, the carriers of the Ny'e that Nyamandu Ruete had fashioned. Nyamandu Ruete then sits in front of his brilliant heart and creates a female equivalent to him, called Nyamandu Suete, or True Mother of Nyamandu. In the same manner, he creates Karai Ruete, who sits in front of his own heart and creates the goddess Karai Suete. Nyamandu Ruete repeats the process, this time Jacqueline Ruete, who in turn creates Jacqueline Suete. Lastly, Nyamandu Ruete creates Tupá Ruete, who then creates the goddess Tupá Suete. These four male gods and their four goddess counterparts are considered to be the true fathers and mothers of the Ny'e, those who will teach the future children of Nyamandu how to live correctly and reach Awije, perfection. In the third chapter, we witness the creation of Uvutenonde, the first land. Nyamandu creates this earthly abode, or Uvurupa, at the end of his staff. He also makes an eternal palm tree stand at the center of the land, while placing one eternal palm tree in each of the four directions, one to the east, the abode of Karai, one to the west, the abode of Tupá, one to the north-northeast, the origin of the spring winds, and one to the south, the origin of the primordial winds of wintertime. The first eternal palm tree at the center of Uvurupa extends toward the zenith of the sky, which is associated with Jacqueline. Thus, with these 5 eternal palm trees, the land is stabilized. Nyamandu then creates 4 staffs to hold up the sky, his celestial dwelling place, known as Uvara. Now everything has settled into its proper place. The first animal said to defile this perfect creation is Mbyá, the original snake, more specifically the Almaden ground snake as identified by Cadogan. The first in the land to sing is Urupa, the original cicada, possibly the large clasper cicada. Then comes Yamai, a kind of aquatic insect that is said to be the master of waters, perhaps a whirligig beetle. Because Nyamandu only created forests, there are no fields, and thus he sends the original grasshopper, or Tuku-Guaraní, to the earth. Wherever the grasshopper lands, patches of grass begin to sprout. To celebrate the appearance of the fields, the Inambu Putin arrives, translated by Cadogan as the red partridge, though it might refer to the brown tinamu. Lastly, we see the arrival of Tatu'i, or the original armadillo, who is made to dig into the soil. A potential candidate for this creature is the 7-banded armadillo in particular. Although mentioned during Nyamandu's time in the primordial darkness, the original owl, or Urukurea'i, is also present as the mistress of darkness in the first land. Meanwhile, the sun, or Quarahu, is named Lord of the Dawn. Here, we can break down Quarahu as a combination of Qua, to know, Ra, to create, and U, mast, column, or manifestation. In other words, it is the manifestation of creative wisdom and power belonging to Nyamandu Ruete. Nothing escapes the creator god's light or sight. All of the original animals, the snake, cicada, aquatic insect, grasshopper, partridge, and armadillo, are described as no longer existing in our present world. Now only images, known as ta'anga, of them remain to populate the land. Cadogan reveals that we humans are ta'anga as well, mere images of the beings who came before us in Uvutenonde. The original animals of Uvutenonde are described as now living on the outskirts of Nyamandu's celestial dwelling place, the Uvara. Having established the physical landscape, Nyamandu turns his attention to the other deities before finally retiring to the depths of his uvara. He makes Karai Ruete master of the Tatarendu, the sacred flames of divine inspiration, as well as the crackling sound of fire. Nyamandu then makes Jakaira Ruete master of the Tatashina, the fog of inspired words that, as a meteorological phenomenon, appears at the start of every spring and is believed by the Mbyá to revitalize the land. Tupan Ruete is designated as master of the waters, from the oceans and streams to rain and thunderstorms, tasked with periodically refreshing the land and its inhabitants. This also makes Tupan master of Uvara Nyamboro roughly translated as temperance or moderation. This naturally counteracts the hot, excitable nature of Karai sacred flames, which can induce Mbuaku Ai, a state of excessive heat and dangerous religious fervor. The revitalizing fog of Jakaira, the inspired flames of Karai, and the refreshing waters of Tupan are meant to create a kind of natural equilibrium. Nyamandu then teaches these other three father gods and the four mother goddess wives how to sing the sacred songs of man and woman, respectively. In this chapter, we are told about conception. Among the Mbyá, it is common to frame the act of conceiving a child as onyemboapuka, as providing a seat. In other words, the process of incarnating the word soul, or nye, is described as a soul being given a rounded stool upon which to sit, just as Nyamandu created the apukapuai as he made the soles of his feet, one of the first acts of his own self-evolution into a human-like form. In the first land, Uvutenonde, it is Nyamandu Ruete, Karai Ruete, and Jakaira Ruete who distribute the nye, creating the first inhabitants. Tupan Ruete is subsequently charged with overseeing the incarnation of future word souls. This also leads to the creation of Tupan Awujei and Tupan Rekoe, sons of Tupan Ruete, also known as Tupan Uma, or primordial Tupan. The title Ruete, or True Father, is used to denote the original gods Nyamandu, Karai, Jakaira, and Tupan. Another term for these four is the Ipuru'a Engvae, those without navels, as they were created, not born of the womb with umbilical cords. This distinguishes them from their Pu'awasu offspring, such as Nyamandu Pu'awasu, who act as intermediary deities between the major gods and the rest of the universe. The Pu'awasu have navels, unlike their parents. Tupan Awujai and Tupan Rekoe fall under this category. Cadogan defines these two minor deities in particular as benefic messengers of Tupan. He also notes that minor deities whose names contain the title Awaete, Kushuvi, and Tekoe are beings tasked with pursuing malevolent spirits. Tupan Rekoe would presumably fall under this category. Returning to the theme of birth, it is said that this life is filled with trials and temptations, the narrator evoking the image of a crying infant, angry from hunger despite having ample access to their mother's breast milk. Thus, the narrative emphasizes the inherent dangers of Mbyá, or the spirit of anger, which influences the child despite them being well fed and cared for. From a young age, the child undergoes lessons and rituals in order to overcome the Mbyá, learning barete, or spiritual fortitude. When the child is old enough to receive a name, a spiritual leader will determine from which portion of the uvara that the child's nye originated. There are situations when a child will not be given a name, such as when they are known to or believed to be the product of adultery, or when the parents have been sexually intimate during the pregnancy. It is said that such offenses induce abortion. If the child survives gestation and birth, it is believed that they will die early. There may also be times when the spirit Mbyá interrupts the line of communication between divinity and spiritual leader in order to plant a mistaken name in place of the child's true name. If this happens, the child will become fussy and die for having been called the wrong name. Chapter 5. In this chapter, death and funerary practices are explored, though not in the context of the creation narrative. Instead, it is mostly the recorded prayers and lamentations of a man whose niece had died. To summarize the orthodoxy among the Mbyá, Cadogan describes a body being interred in a woven basket called Guarapembu, which is made of canes known in Guaraní as tacuapi. Once the flesh has completely putrefied, the bones are carefully washed and kept in a vessel of carved cedar, or ugaru, the same wood used to create the apuka, or traditional stools. The bones may be kept in the home or, more likely, in the village opu, the ceremonial prayer house. Among the Mbyá today, it is customary to bring the bones when moving to a new village or location, though it is not always possible to do so. Chapter 6. In this chapter, we see the flood that destroys the first land, Yvytuko. At this point in the narrative, all the inhabitants of the first earth have achieved indestructibility. Those who led life in accordance with divine law and achieved perfection, or awije, go on to live forever in the Vara, or celestial abode, which is divided into different sections based on direction and the god in charge of that particular amba, or abode. This process of transcendental death through virtuous living is known as kandire. Here in the narrative we also see mention of the minor gods, or Tupí-Guaraní, who have populated the first land and are destined to live for eternity in the Vara with the beings who achieved awije. Meanwhile, those who disobeyed the gods are thus transformed into Guairá, birds, Chiko'i, frogs, and ene, beetles, to survive the flood. Additionally, a woman who was kidnapped is transformed into a deer, or wasu. The flood thus begins, initiated for the purpose of refreshing the world. Here we are also introduced to Ayvu, the Lord of Incest, also known as Kachirito, Lord of Nefarious Unions, who is punished for marrying his paternal aunt. Cultural stories based upon incest taboos are common throughout Amazonia, where in some places endogamic marriages are traditionally more common than exogamic ones. For the average person, it was normal to marry one's cousin, though specifically they had to be the cousin whose parent is the opposite sex of your own parent. In other words, the married couple are usually related by their parents, who are brother and sister, never siblings of the same sex. The story of Ayvu marrying his paternal aunt, the mother of his future cousin bride in an ideal setting, is one of failed sexual restraint. Yet despite not having achieved awije due to the act of incest, both Ayvu and his wife do not die as the waters rise. Instead, they pray, sing, and dance in the rain, swimming through the storm. Filled with religious fervor, the two manage to summon a miracle tree, a two-leaf palm that extends up through the waters and allows the couple to rest in its branches. Once fully rested, they head toward their immortal dwelling in Vera, having proven themselves worthy through the religious fervor brought on by praying, singing, and dancing in the cleansing waters. Chapter 7. In this, the last chapter of the video, we come to know how our present world, or Yvytuko, was created. After the flood, Nyamandu sends a messenger to Kachirito, asking if he is willing to create for the new land. He immediately says no, claiming that he does not want to create anything that is predestined to fade, that is fated not to endure. This hesitation is due to the recent demise of Yvytuko. When the messenger returns and relays this information to Nyamandu, the creator god instructs the messenger to propose the same question to Rapya. Although Rapya laments the inevitable downfall of this new land, saying how evil already exists within it, the god agrees. Known as Miri and Yshapui at this point because he is the creator of our current land, Yvytuko, Rapya first makes the tobacco plant, or petu, as well as the tobacco pipe, known as tatashina kanga, literally the bones that produce life-giving fog, in reference to the tatashina that Rapya brings every spring in order to revitalize the landscape. Yshapui creates these for humans to use as a form of self-defense. Tobacco smoke is known as tatashina rekoashu. Remember that rekoashu refers to mortal imperfection, so tobacco smoke is an imperfect version of Rapya's own divine fog. Imperfect as it may be, the tobacco plant and pipe work as self-defense because the smoke they produce is seen as a purifying agent. The Tupinamba of Brazil were recorded as blowing tobacco smoke over their maracas, made of dried gourds filled with small objects like white quartz crystals, in order to wake them up. The tobacco smoke is what revitalized the maracas and allowed them to be used for spiritual purposes, such as healing. Back in the narrative, Yshapui creates another armadillo. This one is Tava'i, possibly the southern three-banded armadillo, though Cadogan translates it as the red armadillo. This creature, Yshapui dedicates to the grandmother of Yvytuko. He then creates the Iwasu, the religious Mbyá term for the amphisbaena, or worm lizard, alternatively known in Paraguayan Guaraní as Mbyá. The amphisbaena is deemed the mistress of the new earth. Afterward, Yshapui sings the sacred song of man and the sacred song of woman throughout the land. Before he can hear it echoed back, though, his mother calls out. She misses her son, so he returns immediately to her celestial dwelling. This sudden abandonment of Yvytuko is used to explain the presence of mountains and hills, as they are the parts of the landscape that Yshapui did not finish smoothing out before his departure. It is stated that with this, the land of Nyamandu, the first father, has been destroyed, and replaced by the land of Miri. Upon returning to Earth from the house of his mother, Miri decides to impart the gift of fire to his future children. He turns to his son and messenger, Kururu, the common South American toad, and explains his plan. Miri will pretend to be dead so that those who might rise up against him will practice their evil arts upon him, as only they know the magic of fire. Miri instructs his son and messenger Kururu to lie in wait. Once the god shakes and scatters the flames of his enemies, he explains, the toad must swallow up as much of the fire as he can. Miri lies down and spreads himself out upon the land, pretending to be dead. Seeing his son Rapya apparently dead, Nyamandu instructs his son Uruvura, literally future vulture, to go resurrect Miri. When Uruvura finds the body of Miri, he notices how fat the corpse looks and decides to roast it instead of resurrecting it. He calls to his friends, also future vultures, and they gather firewood in order to construct the pyre. After doing so, they ignite the burn pile with their magic. Once the flames grow large enough, Miri shakes violently, scattering the fire. He asks Kururu how much he swallowed, and the toad says none, so Miri once again lies flat upon the earth as though dead. Uruvura and his companions return to build the pyre and reignite the fire. With the flames burning high and hot, Papamiri shakes violently again, scattering the fire. This time, Kururu is able to swallow a tiny bit of it. After confirming this with Papamiri, the toad is instructed to spit out the fire, which he does. Then, Papamiri tells Kururu to fetch him a branch from the laurel tree, or Aju'u. His son, the toad, does so. Afterward, Kururu passes Papamiri one of the god's arrows with a hard point before fetching another plant, this time a subterranean vine called Ushupo Uvuulu, alternatively Amanda Uvo in Paraguayan Guarani. In these plants, Papamiri deposits fire. According to Cadogan, the Mbyá produced fire in this manner when he lived with them, quickly rotating an arrow with a hard point on a piece of Aju'u or Ushupo. The subterranean vine Ushupo is also known as Kururu Rata'u, or Ember of the Toad, in reference to this story and Papamiri's son who swallowed the flames for humanity. As their name implies, the future vultures are punished for roasting the body of Papamiri. Because they disrespected Mbyá-Wasu, or Big Thing, which is the sacred name for the dead human body, Uruvura and his companions are turned into vultures, or Uruvu, those who cannot refuse to eat the Mbyá-Wasu. Reference materials for this video include Ayvu Rapyta, textos míticos de los Mbyá-Guaraní del Guairá by León Cadogan. Amazonian Cosmos, the sexual and religious symbolism of the Tucano Indians by Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov. The Land Without Evil, Tupí-Guaraní Prophetism by Helen Clastres, translated by Jacqueline Grenez Brovender. The Guarani Under Spanish Rule in the Rio de la Plata by Barbara Ganson. From the Enemy's Point of View, Humanity and Divinity in the Amazonian Society by Eduardo Viveros de Castro, translated by Catherine V. Howard. Colonial Kinship, Guarani, Spaniards, and Africans in Paraguay by Sean Austin. A Grammar of Paraguayan Guarani by Bruno Istagaribia. And lastly, Encyclopedia Britannica. Special thanks to my amigo Diego for helping me with the Spanish, and Diego and Jonatan for helping me with the Guarani words and concepts I did not understand.